Bye.
All right, I think we're just about ready to get going here. Just a friendly reminder to put yourself on mute so we don't listen into your conversations you might be having on the side here this evening. Welcome everybody to the first evening lecture of the 2022 summer lecture series. Maybe it's just a hair early for summer, but I think we can start the summer lecture series anyways. It's always a good time to talk science, so I'm ready. Big thank you to Darlings Auto Mall for being the corporate sponsor of the lecture series. I'm Nick Fizichelli. I'm the executive director with Schoodic Institute at Acadia National Park. We are a nonprofit partner of the National Park Service and a center for inspiring science, learning, and community for a changing world. With our National Park Service partners, we co-lead the Research Learning Center located here in Acadia with a wonderful campus located near Schoodic Point, just behind me over there to the right. We work with Acadia, with parks across the region, and with the larger science community of the National Park System on scientific research, on telling the stories of science in parks, and in engaging learners of all ages in science for parks, people, and the planet. So science for change is really our mantra, and really knowing the change is ongoing, the future is going to look different from the present or the past. And so we engage the next generation of learners and leaders and utilize science to make informed decisions for a better future. Our talk this evening, Adventures in Rockweed, Researching the Ecology of the Coast of Maine, is going to be by Hannah Weber, the Marine Ecology Director with Schoodic Institute. I have the privilege to work with Hannah here at Schoodic. She grew up in southern Maine, playing in the seaweeds of Casco Bay. She's worked at Schoodic full-time for 11 years and has been the Marine Ecology Director since 2018. Hannah loves to ask questions. She loves to pay attention, to be astonished, and to ask questions about nature, to borrow a little bit there from Mary Oliver. And so with that, I will hand it over to Hannah to share more on Rockweed.
Thanks, Nick. It's great to see everybody. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to share my screen and we'll get started. I would love it if everybody would put in the chat where you're from. Put your name and where you're from in the chat. That would be great, and that helps us know who's listening in. So thank you. If I can get Susie, could you give me a thumbs up if you can see my slide and if you can hear me all right? Thank you very much. All right, so I got a thumbs up from Susie. I'm so excited to be kicking off the evening lecture series. I'm excited also because well, this is going to be a talk that happens largely outside of the park and the park system. And so it's kind of neat to be thinking about science that we do that can be applied to park settings and outside of park settings. So that's kind of neat. Thanks, Nick, again, for inviting me to give the kickoff talk. Again, Hannah Weber, Marine Ecology Director here at Schoodic. And this talk is Adventures in Rockweed, Researching the Ecology of the Coast of Maine. A quick word about the Marine Ecology Program. The Marine Ecology Program focuses on service to communities and partners while engaging the next generation of scientists and science adjacent professionals in our work. All through the lens of intertidal ecology, both rocky and soft sediment or mudflat ecology. Overlapping my work here at Schoodic is the work I'm a part of as a PhD candidate in the Ecology and Environmental Science program at the University of Maine. I'm in the Conserving Rockweed Animal Systems for Sustainable Harvest, or CRASH, research group. I study rockweed ecology for my PhD research and also for part of my work here at Schoodic. The work that I will be talking about tonight all happened and is happening, will happen in the vast homeland of the Wabanaki people. So, July 2nd, 2019, 4:20 in the morning, Cobb's Cook Bay State Park in Edmonds, Maine. We're breaking down our camp to get to our field site because the day before we had been thwarted in the field by thunderstorms. We are behind schedule and we need to catch up. We need to do yesterday's work and the work that we had scheduled for today, all before our sites get covered by the tide. So why are we breaking down our campsite in the semi-light and close to total silence as we could? Well, you know why it's close to total silence, because if you were camping next to us, you would be exceptionally grouchy if you were woken up at 4:20 by researchers. But we're also there making sure that our rock hammer drill is charged and our propane canisters are full and our GPS is working. What the heck are we doing? Why do we meticulously cut squares out of the intertidal canopy? Why do we string up pool noodles to float amongst the seaweed? And what are these industrious people doing in the seaweed on an afternoon in October? Really, the overarching reasons why is that it's all part of fieldwork to answer two major questions. How much rockweed is there in Maine's intertidal? And how does rockweed harvest affect intertidal ecology? There's, of course, another reason. We were trying to do this before the tide turned. And another part of the answer is that all of the work I'm talking about this evening happens in the intertidal. As such, a critical part of the answer is that there is deep truth in the saying that time and tide waits for no person, including researchers. So a quick word about the intertidal zone. The intertidal is, of course, that thin strip of the planet fringing the continents that is terrestrial when the tide goes out and part of the ocean when the tide is in. Day in, day out, it's ocean, it's out of the ocean, it's ocean, it's out of the ocean. That's the intertidal zone. This in and out of water means that this is an environment of extremes. The intertidal is a tough place, submerged in salt water, emerged and exposed to the beating sun, or freshwater rains, or freezing cold air temperatures, icing, crashing waves, howling wind. And it's a tough place to call home. I mean, unsurprisingly, these extremes and the ever-changing nature creates a stressful living place. Increasing and decreasing light, and increasing and decreasing heat, and drying out. And it's hard to photosynthesize, and it's hard to swim if there's no water to swim in. And there are those smashing and crashing waves and scouring ice. And it's salty, and then it's not salty. It's just unpredictable. And that is a very, very difficult place to live. But this is where rockweed exists. And I fell in love with rockweed and wanted to understand it better. And so fell into the world of tides. And that means getting up early and staying out until dark and doing all of the work that we do to the rhythm of the tides. 9 to 5 means absolutely nothing to the moon and the ocean. That's the intertidal, but this talk is, of course, called Adventures in Rockweed. So having said a little about the intertidal, I also want to say a little bit, more than a little bit, about rockweed. And this is an adventure. So like any good adventure, this started with a goal. I did want to understand rockweed better. I am not sure what scientifically I knew at the beginning of this adventure. As you know, Nick said, I grew up throwing rockweed at my siblings and cousins and getting rockweed thrown at me. It was a two-way street or multi-way street. It was basically just a rockweed fight. But so I guess in the beginning, I knew that rockweed was slippery and it was a good place to find snails. And it was cool to burrow under in hot, hot summer days on the coast of Maine. They do happen every now and again. And all of that is critically important to know, but here are some more important elements probably to know. And I would also want to say that rockweed is a generic term for macroalgae or seaweed that grows on rocks in the intertidal. The rockweed that I am talking about is Ascophyllum nodosum. So rockweed, or Ascophyllum nodosum, is a brown alga found attached to rocks in the mid-intertidal zone. See here on the left, the intertidal, with the arrows pointing to sort of the upper and lower limits of the rockweed. And on the right, of course, we have an image of rockweed at high tide. Rockweed has these many fronds. First of all, it's a long and slender olive green alga. It does grow up to 2 meters tall, although the average height here in the state of Maine is between 60 and 80 centimeters. Again, an individual is made up of many, many fronds, as you can see the upper left-hand image, all growing from a single holdfast. That's that middle image. A holdfast is basically this disc of glue, which is how rockweed is attached to rock. Rockweed, like the name implies, glues itself to rock. You will not find this growing in mud or sand unless it happens to be glued to a rock that's underneath the mud or sand. The fronds over in the right-hand side all have air bladders. These are the bubbles that you see along each frond. They're also called vesicles. Rockweed is flexible. In the previous slide with it in the water, it floats up into the water by means of these air bladders or vesicles that grow alongside fronds when the tide comes in. Rockweed, or Ascophyllum nodosum, is commonly found with Fucus vesiculosus, which is another brown alga. You can tell them apart as Fucus, seen here on the right, has wider fronds, has a raised midrib, and has paired air bladders. The air bladders that you see in rockweed are singular and mid-frond, and on Fucus, they are paired and off to the side of the middle of the frond. We will find rockweed in the intertidal around the North Atlantic only. There are a couple of areas in the Pacific where it's considered an invasive, but this is its natural range from Portugal to the White Sea, over and across to Iceland, and then on the North American continent as far as New York, New Jersey. Throughout its range, it goes by a bunch of different names: egg rack and knotted rack, wig rack, sea lock, egg rack, and Norwegian rack. So lots of different names, historical names for this alga wherever it is. Rockweed grows like other brown algae at its tips, so it'll elongate at the tips, and each year, each frond of an individual will grow one air bladder or vesicle, and you can count the air bladders along one frond, and it will tell you the youngest possible age of that particular rockweed. You can see here on the right, we have sort of labeled 1, 2, and 3 up this frond, and those are annular growth vesicles along that one particular frond. So we can say that that one, if those were all the vesicles or air bladders we saw, we could say that this was no younger than 3 years old. So going back again to that tough intertidal, too much light and can't swim, etc. Rockweed is a foundation for the ecology of this place, of the intertidal. When the tide goes out, the organisms that live in the intertidal are exposed to this incredible heat in the summer, just out there on the rocks roasting, and incredible cold in the winter relative to the ocean. This is in the upper left-hand corner, we have an infrared thermograph of an rocky intertidal site in Nahant in Massachusetts. Rocky intertidal temperatures range significantly based on shape of the rocks, and that creates different microclimates. And these can include areas of really high thermal risk, that's in the red, and areas of thermal refugia, those areas that you see in the blue. The image right next to that is of course what we would see if we were looking at those rocks. This is of course an image when the tide goes out. And when the tide goes out, where there is rockweed, the rockweed drapes over rocks and provides a refuge from extreme heat and wind. And there is wind out there. So wind in either cold or heat means drying out. And if you're an ocean creature, drying out is death. Rockweed itself can withstand these temperature and wind fluctuations and live. It can dry out considerably and still live. And for all of the organisms underneath this blanket of rockweed, the environment stays more constant, especially in the summer. At high tide, rockweed stops being a blanket and it floats up into the water with those air bladders, buoying the rockweed individuals. And this creates a complex habitat for animals that crawl on the rocks and gravel below, crawl on the rockweed, or float above the rockweed, eating and getting eaten. And at high tide, rockweed creates this complex background against which the ecological game of eat and get eaten gets played out. So either draping on the rocks at low tide or creating a complex habitat at high tide, rockweed shapes the intertidal environment. Rockweed is also a harvested marine resource. Why? Why harvest rockweed? This is a paper that came across my desk last fall, effects of Ascophyllum nodosum, that's rockweed, extract on sweet pepper plants as an organic biostimulant in grow box home garden conditions. It's an article, of course, on the use of rockweed foliar spray on sweet pepper plants in an area where synthetic fertilizers should be discouraged. The pepper plants grew better, produced more peppers, and the homeowners did not need to use as much water on their pepper plants. So one of the reasons why people harvest rockweed, it's used in agriculture to condition soil, to stimulate growth, to eliminate or reduce the use of synthetic fertilizers, and to cut down on the amount of water that farmers use on their crops. Just like this fella here, he's pulling out some rockweed and he's going to go use that on his crops or in his gardens, again conditioning the soil and stimulating the growth. It's also used in food, animal feed, and in other products. Rockweed has been harvested in the state for a very long time. It's harvested today, it's been harvested in the past. This is a quote from an article in the Booth Bay Register from the the article is not that old, but Luther Maddox was drying rockweed using a wood-fired rotary drum dryer at Dog Head on Southport Island in the 1860s, making a soil conditioner and sending it to tobacco farmers in Connecticut. This is from 1907. How would you like to be a seaweed gatherer? Farmers in Maine find the marine plant, it's an algae, but marine plant very valuable as a fertilizer. And indeed it is. Today, now there's about 100 licensed harvesters in the state. As harvesters work in their sectors, they are required to leave a minimum of 16 inches of the rockweed above the holdfast. It's about 41 centimeters. And they're required to report their monthly harvest to DMR, the Maine Department of Marine Resources. I would say a note about that 16-inch or 41 centimeter cutting minimum. The regulation in Nova Scotia and New Brunswick is about 5 inches or 12.7 centimeters. And in France, it's between 8 and 12 inches or 20 and 30 centimeters as a minimum. The Maine cutting minimum is a conservative cutting height. It's the most conservative that I know of amongst the countries where rockweed is harvested. Rockweed's growth is apical or from the tips again, and once harvested, the rockweed grows back, just as it would after ice storms or other kinds of storms. It's not harvested again until the biomass, the weight of rockweed in a particular area, has grown back, until the biomass is as it was before that harvest. And that's good management. Harvesters do not keep cutting and cutting and cutting the same area until there's nothing left. That's not sustainable. Good management relies on knowing not only how much there is in any particular harvesting area or sector, but also how much there is in the entire state. Which brings us to our first field adventure. To answer that very question, how much rockweed is there in Maine's intertidal? And the short answer is that we really don't know how much rockweed there is in the state of Maine. And to misapply, a business quote that's probably been misapplied millions of times, it's hard to manage what isn't measured, regardless of who is managing and whether they're managing alone or collectively, a landowner, harvester, resource manager, conservation organization, researcher, etc. We really need to know how much there is in the state of Maine. if you sort of do some kooky back of the envelope calculations, you come up with anywhere from 138 million pounds along the coast, or maybe just shy of 3.5 billion pounds along the coast. It's really hard, and that's a huge difference. So how do you find out how much there is? Currently, the best way to know how much rockweed there is to use satellite images or images of the coast shot from airplanes. There's a few drawbacks to that. Well, clouds. If the tide is in, it's hard to know where the rockweed is or even the extent of the intertidal. Of course, there's clouds. It's actually hard to distinguish between rockweed and that evolutionary cousin, Fucus fasciculosus. And knowing where something is doesn't necessarily tell us how much is there, as we can't really get at volume or biomass simply by looking at the aerial extent. So our solution was to develop a tool that could cover large areas of the coast and could distinguish between rockweed and fucus, and also estimate biomass, not just the aerial extent, but actual weight. Here's our solution: develop a drone-based tool. We still have to fly it at low tide, still don't get away from that one, but we're working with partners at Maine Maritime Academy, Nearview LLC, Bigelow Lab for Ocean Sciences to develop this drone-based tool that can read sort of the light bouncing off of rockweed and distinguish that light from the light bouncing off of fucus and correlate differences in the light with biomass or how much there is. So we've got a drone, we've got an image, we've got a color corrected image, and then we've got sort of the wavelength of what these different species look like, and we can tease those apart to start telling what we've got. Here's a couple of images from one of our field sites. This is at Down East Institute in Beals. On the left-hand side, you can sort of see the image like we would see if we were out there with our own eyeballs. And on the right-hand side, we have a color-corrected image where the images have been sort of translated by the machine learning that has happened with what you see in those little green dots. So all of those little green dots, I mean, a machine does not know what ascophyllum and what fucus are. We have to train it. So after a drone has made a flight over an area, we go out and cut out squares of what is there and measure exactly how much rockweed is there and exactly how much fucus is there. What this looks like in practice is that we get a light signature reading on the ground as well as a GPS reading. Then we cut out what is in those little squares. We sort everything out, one species from the other. And then we do a lot of weighing. This obviously takes a lot of field help. So, and while I should mention that while the drone flights must happen at midday, when there's a low tide midday and the sun is out, the people intensive field work sometimes has to happen well into the late afternoon. Regardless, this field work allows us to marry up the field data, excuse me, with the drone data, basically training the imaging machinery to interpret specific color signatures, not only to specific seaweed, but also our research partners are working out how to train the machinery on how much the biomass, how much seaweed is there. So developing and using this tool that can determine rockweed biomass along the coast will help managers manage the resource better. There is another way to get at how much is there, and that's to weigh rockweed in the field all over the state. Maine has a very long coastline, and that's hard, but not impossible to do it that way. And I'll talk about that in a minute. This particular adventure with the drones and with our amazing and incredible research partners is in the data processing and refining stage. And so I want to move us along to our next field adventure in rockweed, which centers around the question of how does rockweed harvest affect intertidal ecology? I've said already that rockweed grows back after harvest. Solely relying on that one metric, however, the rockweed grows back is not enough, especially for an alga that is foundational to the intertidal ecosystem. So here's our question: how does rockweed harvest affect intertidal ecology? And that brings us back to this morning, very early in the morning, in Cobb's Cook Bay. On that morning, we were headed to one of our 45 research sites. That there is harvest is known. That under the non-Maine circumstances, harvest can have impacts to a varying degree. That's known as well. But what about with Maine regulations? As I've said, these are conservative regulations. We're trying to understand the sustainability of Maine's rockweed harvest, but from a whole ecosystem perspective, which honestly hasn't been done yet. So if we can say something about rockweed harvest from that whole ecosystem perspective, then we're able to contribute our results of research to a conversation that includes managers and regulators and industry and the conservation communities and landowners. And that contribution is something that all of these groups have been asking for. The question of how does rockweed harvest affect the rockweed environment is not a new question. It's not quite as old as how many angels can dance on the head of a pin, but it is old. It's been rattling around long before the 90s, long before this 2014 Maine Department of Marine Resources Rockweed Fisheries Management Plan key needs for future research. But this was, of course, highlighted. So the CRASH, Conserving Rockweed Animal Systems for Sustainable Harvest research team took this first question and ran with it. We've been conducting a research effort to look into harvest and the whole ecosystem since 2018. We also took this second question and ran with it. I'll get to that in a second. So we were looking at the whole ecosystem. We are looking at, how does the rockweed recover from harvest? We're also considering how the invertebrate community that lives in the rockweed recovered. What was it like before harvest and how did it recover afterwards? And we were looking at birds, especially eiders, which use rockweed extensively. There are many bird species that do. And we also looked at the abiotic conditions in rockweed beds, temperature and light and wave intensity. So we looked at a number of different parameters to consider this whole ecosystem, which is again why we were out there in Cobb's Cook Bay on that morning. We were setting up one of our 45 field sites. So in all, we did set up 45 field sites with harvest quality and quantity of rockweed from Casco Bay in southwestern coast of Maine to Cobb's Cook Bay down east. We worked with at least 50 different landowners, the 4 harvest processing companies working in the state of Maine, as well as regulators and conservation groups. We really could not do this work without these partners, and I am grateful to all of them. So setting up a site. When we set up a site, we were, of course, collecting data on the sites themselves, the rockweed, getting a whole bunch of measurements on rockweed, the invertebrates living in the rockweed, the birds coming and going from the rockweed. We also put out sensors at some of the sites to collect continuous data on temperature and light and water motion. All of this requiring a lot of drilling and a lot of hardware installation. And we mapped everything so that we could find our sites again, which was kind of key. And then half of our sites were commercially harvested. Since then, we've been going back to the sites to study how harvest has affected the sites relative to normal life in a rockweed bed under our unharvested or control sites, and to, of course, before harvest conditions on both the control and the harvest sites. We've made over 400 visits to these sites in the summer, fall, spring, and the winter through COVID, after, of course, a court ruling that made harvest a bit more challenging. We've lost gear. We've been pushed off of sites by the rising tide, watched countless sunrises and worked past a few sunsets, and spent a fair amount of time waiting for coffee shops to open for that 4 a.m. or 5 a.m. cup of joe before heading into the field. From 2018 to last summer, summer 2021, we've been joined in the field by a lot of landowners and their dogs, harvest partners and managers, answered loads of questions, really awesome questions, and met truly wonderful and engaged people. It's all been fantastic. But where does that all get us? That's it. Show's over. Gets us to this one data point. I'm joking. That was a joke. But here's this one data point. And I just want to point out that, right, there's a lot of work that goes into one data point. Where do we get sensors? Are they going to work in these conditions? How do we make sure that we don't lose them to the ocean? Do we have permission to install sensors? Is there a low tide during daylight hours to retrieve the data and collect all the rest of the information that we need to know about one site, et cetera? So what is this data point? This data point is the monthly average ambient temperature under rockweed canopy during midday low tide. So sort of, we were thinking this would be the most intense time for us to be looking at. Adding to this, here is the monthly average water temperature under the rockweed canopy, again at midday, but this is high tide. So this is water, near shore ocean water temperature. Also adding to this, finally, here is the monthly average air temperature on bare rock in the intertidal on a midday low tide. So air temperature at the intertidal rock surface. Putting this all together, here's what we see. These are monthly averages. On the x-axis, we have month of the year, and on the y-axis, we have temperature in degrees Celsius. And the data are telling us that rockweed keeps the temperature under that blanket to a temperature that's closer to those of the ocean than to the air. The data from our harvest experiment support that this essential environment forming function does not change with harvest. These data points came into being through a question that needed to be answered, that still need to be answered, that we're working on. Setting up the study, installing the sensors, analyzing a lot of data. And frankly, that's where this adventure is right now. We've collected all of our data and we're processing and synthesizing. We're all pressing through a lot of data. So there will be a lot more. It will be more than just that one data point. There will be a lot more data stories from this work. Right now, I have a couple of other adventures that I want to talk about. Which brings me back to those pool noodles. Let's go back to why do we spring up pool noodles to float amongst the seaweed? I think is a question for the ages. That's going back to this second question that we found in the 2014 Rockweed Fisheries Management Plan. How does the architecture of rockweed affect associated species? And this is a high tide question. At high tide, rockweed creates that three-dimensional complex environment for the cat and mouse game of eat and be eaten. So does harvest affect the shape of rockweed in a way that will result in a change in what lives and eats and hides in the rockweed environment? It might. Here is a quote from Gendron et al. 2017. Size structure can become more skewed without changes in algal biomass as algae get denser and bushier with the proliferation of basal shoots and laterals. It's like side branches, sort of. Although this phenomenon ensures that harvest yields are sustainable and biomass recovers in the long term, a change in the vertical structure of the canopy could nevertheless occur, with possible negative impacts on the associated fauna living in the canopy. In other studies, it does appear that there is a relationship between sort of the shape or the architecture of the algae and the fauna associated with it. The question here is, again, does harvest affect the shape of rockweed in a way that will result in a change in what lives and eats and hides in the rockweed environment. Is it the same or is it not the same? That's kind of a challenge before us. We definitely wanted to be working at high tide, but how do you collect a branchy 1 to 2 meter tall macroalgae at high tide? Here are some of my tips. First of all, you go to the literature and you read what other people have done, and you get creative and you go to fabric and hardware stores and talk to a lot of people. You get comfortable snorkeling with scissors. And you get comfortable doing field work from a paddleboard, or if you're lucky enough, you have some partners and colleagues and harvest partners who will take you out in their boat, which is a kindness, but the paddleboard works too. And so here is how we collected our rockweed samples. We had a cinched bag that we put out at low tide. As the tide came in, the bag remained cinched with magnets and Velcro, and the pool noodles, those really wonderful pool noodles, floated up to the surface of the water. We would then go out on the paddleboard and pull those pool noodles. That would release the magnets and the Velcro, which would allow our cylinder to sort of come up and over all of our rockweed individuals. We cinched off the top, snorkeled down to the bottom with our scissors, and cut off the bottom of the rockweed, pulling it up. And voila, you had an individual in a bag. We did this at 12 different sites along the coast. We had 4 different harvest conditions. So we had control sites, 3. Those are the ones with the white sea. 3 control sites. 3 sites that had been harvested a year before we went out and collected, 3 sites that were harvested 2 years before, and then 3 sites that had been harvested 3 to 4 years before we went out and did some collection. So we've got these individual rockweeds from areas of different known harvest histories. We've removed all of the individual invertebrates from them. We've collected different measures on the architecture, and now we're relating the invertebrates on the number and the species to the architecture. Here's a question for all of you. This is hard. Identifying and counting bugs is very straightforward, but to say something about bugs and bushiness, now that's another matter, because you have to put a number on something amorphous like bushiness. And we've worked on several different measurements to capture bushiness in the net of numbers. But I would love it if everybody put in the chat, like, how would you put a number on something that's bushy? How would you put in the chat how you would turn something squishy like bushiness into numbers? I'm curious to see what other people would say. So feel free to put some comments in the chat on how you would change bushiness into numbers. This adventure, like the others, is well into the data processing and synthesis stage, finding those patterns between invertebrates and habitat architecture. I have one more adventure to talk about, and this is one we would love to have field help with. And it takes us back to these people in the field last October. You know what we discovered? There are many, 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 many people along the coast that care about rockweed. And often what we find is, that leads to the question of what can I do? What can I do? What can I do? In the back of the 2014 Department of Marine Resources Rockweed Fisheries Management Plan, there is this appendix which has a biomass assessment methodology with a lot of data to collect, but very little about how. And without that, how to collect these data, there could be huge discrepancies in how the data were collected, and therefore, some huge concerns about comparability of the data, validity of the data, et cetera. That would lead to problems, and that's no good. What we proposed and what we were funded to do was develop a citizen science protocol to operationalize what was in that appendix, to turn it into something that could actually be used, with the goal of developing a standardized method to collect rockweed biomass data that almost anyone could use. We brought together stakeholders to understand concerns and elicit feedback on the work. And then we co-developed a protocol with our stakeholders, and then we field tested the protocol. In this series of slide pictures, we have our stakeholders on the right-hand side. There they are at Island Institute. We're very grateful that we got to use that space. We did haul all of the rockweed up to their third floor meeting room so that we could practice weighing with different methods. And then on the right-hand side, we are field testing our protocol. And last fall, we rolled out Project ASCO, assessing seaweed with community observations. Our goal is to train people to weigh rockweed in their local communities and to make the data accessible and available to everyone: managers, landowners, harvesters, conservation groups, school teachers, university professors, you name it. It is a citizen science initiative to weigh as much rockweed as we can along the coast of Maine. It involves getting trained, weighing rockweed, recording data, and then accessing data on a shared website. Again, why? Because better data helps make better decisions, and the coast and how we use it is changing. We know there's a data gap, and gosh, it's really fun to be out collecting data with lots of people. We train folks, we provide materials, we help people find sites to collect data from. And again, the data are available for anyone through the anecdata.org website. The field season for collecting data is June through October. We will have trainings in June. The dates and locations will be on the website, the Schoodic Institute website, in early June. We would love your help. We would love to get as many people out there on the coast as we can, helping to collect and sharing rockweed data. The questions that we're trying to answer are tough, and they're necessary, and the field adventures have been hard, but also a lot of fun. None of these adventures are over. Some of them are quite new. And we knew that all of them are going to lead to other new adventures with a whole host of people. I'm very fortunate. We are all very, very fortunate to be supported in all of this work. And I just wanted to thank everybody who has helped us with the field work, with sussing out things for the crash team. The UAS team is the drone work, and of course Project ASCO, and we can't thank our volunteers enough for that. So I just wanted to end by saying thank you to everybody who has helped make this work possible. And with that, I am happy to stop sharing and take questions.
All right, thank you very much, Hannah, for taking us on a rockweed adventure. You're asking some really interesting, really fundamental questions about this important both resource and species along the coast of Maine, and as you showed in the range map, all the way across the North Atlantic. So we definitely have time for some questions. Folks can put some questions in the chat. I did put links to a couple of articles and a link to the ASCO, Project ASCO article. And then here's also a recent article, actually a couple of years ago now, by Catherine Schmidt on all of Hannah's questions that she likes to ask. All right, so as people are thinking about questions, I will start, and folks can add questions in the chat, or you can raise your hand as well. We're an intimate group here. You can definitely raise your hand. So Hannah, as you know, my background's forest ecology, so everything is a tree to me. And so rockweed is this like macroalgae, is just kind of a crazy thing. You mentioned it's usually about 60 to 80 centimeters long, can grow to about 2 meters. Is it really well understood what drives the growth rate of rockweed?
Sure. So there are many, many things that contribute to growth, and also to whether or not it gets thrashed and then trimmed back. It's nutrient availability, it's light availability, it is how dynamic the environment is, whether it is sort of closer to a headland and therefore exposed to more waves, or whether it's in a more low energy area. So all of those things contribute to varying growth rates.
Let's see, there's a comment from Robin about commercial harvest in some areas potentially having more severe or intense harvesting than elsewhere. Robin is asking about sort of percent biomass removed. Were you able to, in your studies, assess how much was removed from the study sites?
Yeah, and it's a great question. I want to point out that harvest is not a buzz cut, and it is highly variable. And it's highly variable for many different reasons. We have, for all of our sites, calculated the percent of biomass moved, and there is variability between our sites, certainly. And we do see some variability in response relative to how much was removed. Some of our responses are completely independent of how much was removed, and some are not. There's variability. That's all I can say to that. The commercial harvesters, the fisheries management plan, as Robin knows, was not adopted, but it is a guideline that the harvesters do use. There is sector-based management, and the harvesters endeavor to remove no more than 17% of the existing biomass, the standing stock, from a sector per year. And so whether or not that 17% is removed from one bed, or whether that 17% is spread out and removed from the entire sector, really depends on the harvester, their goals, their machinery, or hand harvest, etc. So there are many, many variables that go into where there's intense harvest and where there is more dispersed harvest. In any particular site, there's going to be variability in terms of contour, et cetera, on how much of an impact there is on any particular site as well. Sector sizes vary. I see Susie's question. Susie's question is, how big is a sector? And sector sizes vary. You can go to the Maine Department of Marine Resources website and go to their map of rockweed harvest sectors.
Let's see. I don't see any hands up yet, but another question, Hannah. You showed how rockweed is really important in a sort of ameliorating the conditions in the intertidal, and specifically the temperature, and thus at low tide, it stays cooler beneath the rockweed, and it plays an important role as a habitat for organisms. Is it also a source of food, source of energy for animals? Does anything eat rockweed?
So yes and no. When the rockweeds are small and they haven't developed chemical defenses, then they're just like lettuce almost. They're highly edible. So small alga are eaten by a host of different organisms. However, once rockweed attains a particular size and start investing their energy in chemical defenses, then they become relatively inedible. Smooth periwinkles will graze on rockweed. Common periwinkles do not, and it's very infrequent that organisms graze on rockweed. So they're really not terribly edible. Interestingly, rockweed does slough its epidermis, so it does slough its outer layer routinely, and that's eaten like I don't know, ribbon candy or something. It also contributes to the ecosystem through the food webs through the detrital pathway, through stuff that breaks off and starts to break down, and that is its enormous contribution to the food web, is through a detrital or dead things pathway.
So Trina did ask a question about if there's areas along the coast where perhaps harvesting could have more of an impact than others. Is there any sense on that?
Sure, and that's one of the reasons. Yes, there are areas along the coast where it's quite probable that intensive rockweed harvest would have a greater impact than not, and those are areas where we may see increase in sea ducks or something. That's really all I want to say about that. I would say though, to Trina's question, source in Casco Bay, Cundy's Harbor specifically, they've been harvesting for over 40 years and have really worked the area extensively, and I don't think, and sustainably, I mean, they've been at it for over 40 years and continue to harvest and continue to have exceptionally high yield. And if anything, I think they're an exemplar of how to have a sustainable harvest. And so I know your question was about worry, but I think we could actually look to, the Southern Maine harvesters and look to them as exemplars. So if we are worried, there are exemplars in the state that we could turn to for good, better, best management practices from industry.
Great, and I see, let's see, there's a couple more from Robin, but I'll first go to one from Catherine, who hasn't asked a question yet. And hers is, after all these adventures, how have your ideas and feelings about rockweed changed?
I still love rockweed. Still think rockweed is a great organism and a really amazing system to study. I am in awe of this alga, that it persists in an incredibly difficult environment, that it can that can largely dry out, and then as the tide comes back in, it can just wave and move about so much with the ocean that it's just a delight to watch. So I still love it. My ideas and my questions around it have certainly morphed, and I really would love to be able to understand better what happens to rockweed when it does wash up and raft, like who eats it and how does that contribute to the terrestrial food web. And same when it does, when there are fronds that break off and raft up and move out into the ocean, how much carbon is being transported out into the ocean through that pathway. And what is it doing, as you get these floating mats out in the ocean, like what is the community assemblage that occurs in those floating mats? So ideas abound from working in rockweed.
Great, and before I forget, next month's summer lecture is on June 14th, and it will be Paul Anderson, who's the executive director with the Maine Center for Coastal Fisheries. The title of his talk is Competing for the Commons Along Maine's Coast, and I just put in the link to our events page, and you can learn more about the talk there. Here's a person asking a question here. Is anyone assessing the potential erosion mitigation impact of harvesting?
Yeah, so one thing we were looking at with our study is water motion, and how water motion is or is not affected by harvesting. To date, our data don't support that there's any change in how water is moving in our harvested versus our unharvested areas. But I think that there's a lot more study to be done in that regard. There's a lot more study to be done in that regard. So, I mean, that's a great thing to be studying. I do
Great,
see,
and perhaps,
yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
go ahead.
That's okay.
Go ahead, Hannah.
So I did see that Robin has a management question about removing the commercial incentive to harvest rockweed habitat on conservation islands and mainland areas. I'm not 100% sure there is a commercial incentive to harvest rockweed habitat on conservation islands and mainland areas over any other areas along the coast. So I don't know where the incentivization of that is. And I would actually sort of, I think this is a great question. And I'm not necessarily going to answer it with a management thing, except to say that I think that if we keep the amount of rockweed that can be harvested in a sector in one place, but we have a greater area open to rockweed, then actually we reduce the effect on any one place. So I agree, there should be conservation areas that are set aside. There should be research and study areas set aside. But I think if I wanted to improve sustainability, even from what it is, then I might consider keeping a fair amount of the coast open to harvest, so that if we continue to close and close and close areas of the coast that can't be harvested, it increases the pressure on those smaller and smaller areas where harvest can occur. And I think that that is not good management.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Hannah, and once again, big thank you for sharing and taking us on an adventure in Rockweed tonight. Thank you all for coming. Have a wonderful evening, and we look forward to seeing you next month or at one of our other upcoming events. So do check out our events page at schoodicinstitute.org. Have a wonderful evening, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good evening.